Be going over group policy. Group policy is a tool that allows you to create and deploy policies and settings for the users and computers within your domain. Now, I'm not going to be able to cover the entirety of group policy and all that you can do with it in this lecture, and the reason for that is because there are literally thousands of potential policies that you could push out. Instead, what we'll do is we'll use some common examples and ones that would fit within the context of our imaginary business that we're setting up. So first we need to make sure that group policy management is installed, and if you remember back when we installed AD domain services, we checked the box for group policy management so that we wouldn't have to do it around here at this time. But we can still make sure it's installed if we go to add roles and features within the server manager. And group policy is a feature, so we'll skip ahead down to the features section and we'll see the group policy management is already installed. And if it wasn't, we could go ahead and check the box, hit next, and install that. And to open group policy management, we'll go to the top right hand corner to tools and we'll click group policy management. And the snap-in will open. In the top left hand corner you'll see our forest, test.local, and then you'll see domains, and then you'll see our domain that we've created, test.local. Now, when we talk about group policy in terms of structure, we need to realize that everything that you do in group policy is OU based, a lot like Active Directory. So you'll see our Active Directory OUs on the left hand side, CM East, West, Domain Controllers, Headquarters, and the first thing that we need to talk about when we're creating policies that we're going to apply is that when we create a policy, we're not only working within the context of which users or computers am I going to apply this policy to, we also need to pay attention as to where we are linking those policies as to the OUs that they're placed in. When we create a policy, let's say we create a policy in the headquarters OU. Regardless of what users or computers that we apply the policy to, they must be within the headquarters OU in Active Directory in order for that policy to apply. If I created a policy in headquarters and applied it to a user that was in CM West, that policy would not apply. I have to make sure that when I create a policy in the headquarters OU or any other OU, I'm applying that to users and computers that I want to be applied that are in the headquarters OU. So pay attention to the structure when you're setting up domain or group policies, and always keep in mind that when you place it in an OU, you're only applying that to the users and computers that you set that exist within that OU. So in the top you'll see a default domain group policy object. This one comes built in when you install group policy management. And if we go into the settings, we can see some of the settings that exist within this particular policy. By default, it sets a password policy, an account lockout policy, a Kerberos policy, security, encrypting file systems. We're not going to go over every single one of these, but the most common that we're going to set up is these top two, the password policy and the account lockout policy. The password policy, that is simply a policy that applies to the characteristics of a user's password. When do they need to reset their password? Does the password need to be a certain length or have a certain amount of complexity? How many passwords can they reuse, or can they reuse any? So that's a policy that we would set up for the entire domain in most cases. We also want to set an account lockout policy. Basically, when a person enters an incorrect password a certain number of times, they'll get locked out of their account. That is where we set that setting. So with this default domain policy, we're going to go ahead and edit this. Now, since this policy is not in an OU, it's right underneath the domain, this is what we would call a global or a global domain policy. It applies to all the OUs. If you place a group policy object within an OU, it only applies to that OU. But if we have a policy like the default one that's placed outside of all the OUs, it will apply to the entire domain. So we'll right click this and hit edit, and then the group policy management editor will open. This is where we can edit this particular group policy object. And you can see its name right here at the top. So if you ever don't know which, or if you ever forget which one you're working with, that will be the name of the policy you're working with. Now if we step back for a moment and we look at the settings for this group policy object, you'll see that there are two sections. One is the computer configuration and one is the user configuration. And we can see that also in the group policy management editor for this particular group policy object. You'll see a section for computer and user. And the difference between the two is that there are certain policies that apply to users, certain policies that apply to computers. And as you get more familiar with group policy, you'll start to remember where things are located. Certain policies would only apply to that user account, or certain policies would apply to the whole computer. And there are even some policies that you could apply to either because of the way that that policy gets applied. Now, we're not going to go into depth as to which policies are where, because that's something that would take a little while to go over. And again, there are many policies that we could cover. But for right now, we're primarily going to be covering computer policies. The reason for that is because they affect every user that logs onto that computer, and we're mainly setting up security policies for the users that log in. So if we just follow the hierarchy that it's got listed in here, we can go into Policies under Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, and then Security Settings. And looks like we're going under Account Policies, Password Policies. So there's Account Policy, Password Policy. So there it is. This is where we can change the settings that are in here, and you can see what's currently set. So let's go over just some of the basics. Now when we're editing a group policy here, these are a policy and a policy setting. If I double click this, I can change the setting. Now in most built-in group policy options that you have the ability to change, you can, if you don't know what it does, you can always click this Explain tab, and it will tell you in detail what this setting will do, what options you have to change, and what will happen when you change that, either if it's a true or false, or if it's a number that you need to set, what will changing that do. So always read over the explanation if you don't know what you're changing or what you're doing. This will always give you some good insight as to what we're doing. But with the secure policy setting, this is a enforced password history. So when a user changes their password, they can't use that old password again until a certain amount of password changes. So let's set this to something like 12. So a user will need to change their password 12 times before they can reuse an old password. And you can set this as low or as high as you want to, or you can set it to 0 to turn it completely off. So we're going to set it as 12 and hit apply. And then the maximum password age, and if we hit explain, this will tell us what that does. And basically what this setting is how old can the password be before the user needs to change it. So after 42 days, the user will need to change their password. When they go and log in, they will be forced to change it. Now they will also get a warning that, hey, your password is coming up for expiration. Do you want to change it now? And that counter will reset. So let's change that to something like 3 weeks. Let's set that for 21 days. A lot of businesses do this about a month. I'll do it for 3 weeks, just as an example. And the minimum password age, that is usually not, doesn't need to be set. That can be used in specific use cases. We'll leave that as 1 day. Minimum password length, that's pretty self-explanatory. How long does their password need to be? It doesn't matter if it's letters and numbers. It's not talking about that. It's just talking about how many characters long is it. We'll leave it at 7. That's good. Password must meet complexity requirements. Now, by default, Windows Domain doesn't really allow you to say, I need this many numbers, this many characters, or this many special characters, that sort of thing. They just have an on or off. Does the password need to be complex, or can it be simple? And what they mean by complex is it needs to have these particular requirements. So it needs to be 6 characters in length, contain characters from 3 of these 4 categories. It's got to have uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and special characters. So it is a good idea to leave this enabled. That greatly enhances the security in your network. You definitely don't want somebody being able to guess or brute force their way in, so we'll leave that on. The last option is whether or not the passwords for users are stored on the domain controller using a method of encryption that's reversible. And what that means is when a password is set on a user, that is stored in such a way that the password cannot be decrypted very easily. And so we want to keep that disabled. We want to make sure that our passwords aren't easy to get to. So that's it for the password policy. Let's go to the next one, account lockout policy. That's just below that. So account lockout duration. Now what this is how long is the user locked out if they get their password incorrect so many times. So we're going to define this. If we check the box, and now normally it's undefined, and what that means is that the policy is simply turned off. So we'll go ahead and define this policy, and let's say we'll lock them out for 30 minutes. That sounds fine. Now it's going to give us a warning. These other two need to be enabled and configured in order for that policy we just changed to be changed successfully. So it's going to put some defaults in there. We'll go ahead and change those after the fact. So we'll apply that, hit OK. Account lockout threshold. How many times does the user enter their password incorrectly before it locks them out? 5, that sounds just fine. And reset account lockout after how many minutes? So they'll get locked out for 30 minutes, and after that 30 minutes is up, the account will be re-unlocked, so to speak. We'll leave that enabled, that's fine. So that's it for our two most common policies, and we're applying this again to a computer configuration, and since it's directly underneath our domain, it's not in any OUs, it's going to get applied to all of the computers within that domain. But we need to make sure first that our scope is applied correctly. So we're going to close this, and next we're going to click the Scope tab. Now, in our default domain policy, you'll see that it's applying to this domain, test.local, and it's filtered to these objects, and the object that it's filtering to is authenticated users. Now it may be confusing. We've got a policy that's being applied to the entire domain, but there's only computer policies in it, yet we're filtering it down to authenticated users. It really doesn't matter if you're applying a policy to users or computers. You generally want to only apply it to user objects when you're talking about security filtering. So the fact that this says authenticated users, that's perfect. We want that to always be the users that we want to apply that policy to, because when that user logs in, that computer policy will apply to that particular computer as long as it is a computer within the domain, since we've applied this policy here. So what I'd like to do next is create a policy for the financial folks that work at the headquarters at our imaginary car dealership. Now the financial people are probably working on important accounting stuff, and they probably have some sensitive information on their computers, and we want to make sure that their computers lock if they get up and walk away for a certain amount of time. That's so that nobody can just walk up and start messing around and look at things that they shouldn't see. So we're going to create a policy in the headquarters OU. We'll go ahead and click that, and then right click and click Create a GPO in this domain and link it here. We're going to name this GPO, so we're going to say Screen Timeout. And now you'll see that that GPO is applied. If we expand headquarters, we'll see that that's been applied. And by default, it automatically puts our authenticated users, and that's fine. So we're going to go ahead and edit this policy and right click it. Click Edit. So we're going to set up an inactivity lock. After the machine is inactive for so much time, the computer will automatically lock. This policy is located under Computer Configuration, Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Local Policies, and then Security Options. So the policy we're looking for is under Interactive Logon, and it's called Machine Inactivity Limit. We're going to double click that. We're going to check the box to define the setting, and we'll set that to something like 5 minutes. Look, notice that it's asking for it in seconds. Again, we can always click Explain if we want to get a definition of that policy. So now once we click Apply and click OK, you'll see that the policy's been defined. It's been set at 300 seconds. And if we exit the Group Policy Editor and then click Settings for this group policy, we'll see that the interactive logon policy has been set to 300 seconds. So now when a computer is within the headquarters OU and a user logs onto it, once that computer has been inactive for 300 seconds or 5 minutes, that computer will automatically go to the screensaver and then lock. So when that user comes back, they'll need to sign back in order to unlock the computer. Now we need to make sure that this policy is applying to the particular users we want it to apply to. Right now we've got this group policy object, or GPO, in the headquarters OU. So we know that it's only going to apply to things that are in that headquarters OU. So we know that we've got the location right. But now we're going to go to Scope, and we'll see that security filtering is set to authenticated users. And what that means is users that have been authenticated and logged onto the computer in the domain network. But we don't want to just apply this to authenticated users to all of them. We want to apply it to only the financial folks. So if we go back into Active Directory, and again we can go to Server Manager, Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers, and if we go to the headquarters, we'll see that we set up a accounting group. Now when we're creating this group policy, when we're setting up filtering, we can apply it to groups, users, and computers. So perfect, we have a group that applies to this particular GPO that we want to push this GPO out to. So we'll click Remove on Authenticated Users, and we'll click Add, and then we'll type our accounting group. We'll see it underlined, so it found it. Hit OK. And so now we've got that group set up. This GPO will apply to users that are in the accounting group as long as those members are in the headquarters OU. So we've successfully set up our GPO. It's going to apply to our users that we want to apply it to. So that's the basics of setting up a group policy object. And again, when we're setting up group policy, keep in mind that there are literally thousands of policies that we could set up for computers, for users. We can set up scripts that run when the user starts the computer or logs on or logs off. There are many, many options in terms of setting up the computers in your network the way that you want through group policy. A really good resource to use is TechNet's website, and I've included a link within the lecture resources that will take you to basically a list of all of the group policies and what they do. Of course, you can always use that tool within group policy to get an explanation, but TechNet is a really good resource to look at some of the more common group policy objects and what's common practice in terms of keeping your domain secure, as well as the workstations and user accounts within your domain.